제 전부도 님이죠. 돈은 뭐는 전부 나게도 나그러다 감산도 실물도 tum바도 제잔라 기숑서 내셔로 저기 장감서 저것도 기숑로 열라는 지금 반조자라 소라 공주 도반보르 신지로 공주 도반보르 신지로 공주 도반보르 신지로
Profound and subtle Dharma is rarely encountered in eons. Now we hear and follow it. May we realize the Tathagata's meaning. To liberate beings, please generate bodhicitta before teaching. Today we will continue discussing the Shurangama Sutra. The content of the Shurangama Sutra is quite extensive. I'm not sure how long it will take to cover everything. As for the Vimalakirti Sutra, we spent more than 2 years on it, about 2 years or so. This one might take even longer than 2 years, but I don't know for sure. It certainly seems like there's a great deal to go through, no matter what. But everyone has already made this aspiration. We should dedicate some time each and every year to study the Shurangama Sutra. I sincerely hope everyone can try their best to make time for this. And then, by all means, come to listen and to learn. It is always for the best to start well and to finish well. That is precisely what I am thinking as well. Because, there are so many different uncertainties in our lives, whether it's external conditions or internal factors, and even more importantly, impermanence and death, and so on. But if none of these things happen, then no matter what, it is best for us to diligently complete the study of this entire sutra. That is a very important principle that we should follow. Now, as for our study of the Shurangama Sutra, we have now reached the section in our discussion covering the 7 ways of seeking the mind. And regarding these 7 specific methods, it is truly essential to grasp that they are of great importance because we can even consider them as esoteric teachings. If they are esoteric teachings, they are very closely related to directly pointing out the nature of mind, the commentary on direct pointing to mind nature by His Holiness, because direct pointing to mind nature is a Dzogchen text by Mipham Rinpoche, and His Holiness once wrote a commentary on it. We have also gone through it once before, and at the very beginning I also translated it. But that translation was rather archaic. A few years ago, I retranslated it in a way that is a bit easier to understand. At that time, His Holiness also personally wrote a preface. In this particular Dzogchen teaching, many different methods for observing the mind are thoroughly discussed at the beginning. Then, using the Madhyamaka method of observation and the Mahamudra method of resting the mind and so on. Actually, some of the observation methods in this text are actually quite similar to the 7 methods of mind investigation that we're discussing in this section. In fact, they are remarkably similar in their approach as well. Now, during our own process of study, it is certainly possible that some of the great masters of the past do not always explain these things in a great amount of detail. But we should come to understand it through methods of observation. It is important to first recognize our own mind. To help with this process, there are 7 methods of mind investigation. For example, these methods were taught in the past by masters such as Jiao Guang and can be found within their commentaries. The explanations provided here are slightly different, so what specific kind of differences are we talking about? Now, regarding the entire approach to mind investigation, in terms of methodologies and various approaches of observation, a number of great masters, including Jiao Guang and many others, when discussing the first 7 methods of mind investigation, mainly focus on investigating the dwelling place of the mind. After we finish discussing the 7 methods of mind investigation, we move on to the topics of deluded thoughts and discriminating mind. It is believed that we need to discern deluded thoughts and discriminating mind in this way. For example, the great master Uyi, in his own detailed commentary, also very clearly states that all of the previous 7 methods of mind investigation mainly serve to discern the conceptually constructed phenomena. The latter part of the discussion delves into the important Buddhist concept of dependent origination, which is also known as dependent arising. Furthermore, later influential masters, such as Master Chang Shui, generally praised and supported many of the core viewpoints originally articulated by Master Uyi. In other words, as long as we thoroughly and completely explain the 7 methods of mind investigation and are able to understand them, then it's very much like breaking into a city. The thieves inside the city are much more easily discovered. In the same way, if we are truly able to find our own inner mind, and it has absolutely nowhere left to hide, then it stands to reason that this mind is also remarkably easy to find. And ultimately, deluded thoughts can also be dispelled. Perhaps many great masters in Chinese Buddhism, including Master Wu, all relied on a combination of the Tiantai school and the Yogacara school as their approach to teaching. Sometimes they would often use the three contemplations of the Tiantai school, or sometimes it refers to the three natures of the Yogacara school of thought. That is, the imagined nature, the dependent nature, and the perfected nature, to explain things in this way. Perhaps even much earlier, including Jiaoguang Zhenjian, Master Jiaoguang, they would often discuss the true abiding place of the mind, or indeed the origin and the destination of the mind, observing things from this very perspective. Isn't this similar to what we have in Vajrayana, especially in our Dzogchen teachings, where it is quite close and similar? So when it comes to these 7 ways of investigating the very nature of the mind, some people, for example, might actually think that it is something that all sentient beings have as a conceptual, discriminative, imagined nature. We need to disprove this imagined nature when deliberating on the abiding place or the fundamental nature of the mind. Or, in some specific cases, we can begin to consider whether this mind, whether it has an abiding place or not. Because recently, as we all know, it was mentioned earlier that if the mind is inside, that doesn't hold. If it's outside, that doesn't hold either. If it's between the sense bases, that also doesn't hold. For the 4th way of investigating the mind, it discusses inner perception and outer perception. Between perceiving the outer and perceiving the inner, the focus is on refuting this inner perception. That is to say, perceiving the inner also doesn't hold. This is how it is refuted. So, what can we truly observe from all of this? Well, in fact, within the teachings of the Shurangama Sutra, it should be understood that, on one hand, through our method of logical investigation, relying on this kind of logical analysis, we keep asking questions and continuously begin to carefully observe and thoroughly analyze. Then, ultimately, in the end, what is referred to as the so-called mind actually has no inherent nature or characteristics at all. We need to reach this kind of realization. Of course, here, it is conceivable that Venerable Ananda continues to ask, and in response, the Buddha continues to answer him. It's as if Venerable Ananda is representing people like us today, just like those in the academic community. For people in academia, no matter what the issue is, it's either considered external or internal, or perhaps in between, or they believe there must be some kind of essence or substance. If there is an essence, in what particular way do we begin to understand it? This specific kind of thinking, this academic mindset that we are referring to, is actually very important as well. We shouldn't blindly or ignorantly accept any teaching or dharma. Although in Buddhism faith is very important, this particular kind of faith absolutely must be established on the solid foundation of wisdom. Only then can it be called right faith. If it doesn't require any wisdom or discernment at all, and if you just follow what other people say and believe in it far too easily, that is what is called superstition. Therefore, our own faith should be built upon a much more thorough process of very careful and detailed observation. If you reach such a conclusion after this process, in that case, the faith that is established is genuinely solid and steadfast. This kind of correct faith is also something that, during the ongoing process of observation and self-examination, every single person should, on the one hand perhaps, not always approach with an academic mindset. It's a state of mind where one is constantly thinking that this particular thing is wrong and that other thing is also incorrect, always taking an oppositional stance, or perpetually looking for any and all faults in every single thing. For example, this very morning I had a conversation with a steward, but it turned out that in one of the specific photographs he showed me, the steward's primary responsibility is to actively look for any potential problems that might arise. This function is quite similar to the role of our modern-day police force. To provide a clear example of this, in a video that was filmed at one of our monasteries, I said, "This video from the monastery is very good." Then he said, "Look, this person is using a cell phone, this person isn't wearing a hat, and this person is dozing off." He immediately spotted the shortcomings of 3 people. When I watched it myself, I genuinely didn't notice any of that. In fact, I thought, The hats they were wearing looked very dignified, and the Buddha statue in front was also very dignified. Then the two of us, I said jokingly, I was looking at it with a completely faithful attitude. So what I saw seemed like, oh, this is also very good. That one is also very good. But maybe he, because of his own personal work or something, immediately after he finished speaking, when I looked again, it was true, there really were such issues inside. So when we analyze the scriptures and treatises, some people might have a very strong academic mindset, especially those who mainly focus on picking faults. They immediately say, this is unreasonable, that is unreasonable, and might even point out some mistakes. If someone has some faith, or if he directly... I'm not saying that, I mean this is a positive analogy, but sometimes when we are genuinely and deeply engaged in our studies, we might also need to observe the continuous flow of our own mental continuum. I believe that some Dharma friends here among us, from a worldly perspective, you are actually quite well read and knowledgeable. You have probably read a great number of books in the past, and in society as well, your sharp intellect is recognized by others. And you also feel that you yourself, from elementary school to middle school and then on to university, I have always won awards. It has simply been like this all along. So you think your intelligence is quite good. At this point, you might use your own intelligence to look for flaws in the Buddhist scriptures. If that's the case, our practice may not be very successful. So for people like this, it's absolutely necessary to increase your faith a little. You should look at the profound meanings in Buddhism from a positive perspective. Some people, on the other hand, are always rather superstitious or are easily convinced. These kinds of individuals should really work on increasing their wisdom. It is essential for them to cultivate a structured and logical approach to their thinking. True wisdom, which is distinct from mere information, should be acquired through the dedicated process of reasoning and thoughtful analysis. Developing this fundamental skill is of utmost importance for their personal growth. Now let's go on talking about the Shurangama Sutra. Also, I was looking into the record of Buddhist kingdoms, an important historical text. This record was written by the Chinese Buddhist monk Faxian from earlier times. This work is also known by another title, The Biography of the Eminent Monk Faxian, and it describes something very interesting. So what exactly does it say? When he arrived at the new city, he had brought with him offerings of fragrant incense, beautiful flowers, and burning lamps. And, accompanied by several fellow monks, he proceeded to make solemn offerings at the sacred location of Vulture Peak. Then, at that very moment, he suddenly remembered that this was the hallowed ground where the Buddha had expounded the profound teachings of the Shurangama Sutra. Upon this realization, he became overcome with a deep sorrow and began to weep right there on the spot. After crying, he said, "When the Buddha was in the world, I, Faxian, did not come here. I only came here later. But now everywhere around him are just ancient relics, and so he chose to stay there inside a simple cave. The location itself was described as what appeared to be a cave or a grotto, and the account mentions that they spent a full day there, staying for the entire day. This specific event is documented in a historical record which can be found within the ancient text known as the Record of Buddhist Kingdoms. It goes into detail about the teachings of the Shurangama Sutra. But I do think that when it comes to the Shurangama Sutra, because in terms of the particular time it was translated, if we look at when it was translated into Chinese, now there might be some potential discrepancies in the timeline we are discussing. We say that the Shurangama Sutra was translated in the year 705 AD. However, as for Faxian, he lived from the 300s to the 400s AD. There should be a pretty substantial gap in between. So in this particular situation, it's extremely likely that at that time, what Faxian read was the Sanskrit version, the Sanskrit text of the Shurangama Sutra. Also, regarding the Shurangama Sutra, it might have actually been the Shurangama Samadhi Sutra, although both the Record of Buddhist Kingdoms and the Biographies of Eminent Monks refer to it as the Shurangama Sutra. It may have actually been the Shurangama Samadhi Sutra, because when it comes to the Shurangama Samadhi Sutra, it was actually spoken by the Buddha at Vulture Peak. Because in our version of the Shurangama Sutra, as we mentioned earlier, it was set in the Jeta Grove. And now we find ourselves between Vulture Peak and the Jeta Grove. It seems they're quite far apart, not extremely far, but there is still a certain distance between them. Of course, it is also entirely possible that the Buddha taught in various different places and that in the end these teachings were compiled into a single scripture. That is certainly a possibility as well. So, as we analyze this process, the Shurangama Sutra mentioned in the biography of Faxian, this could possibly be a reference to what is known as the Shurangama Samadhi Sutra. It's also possible that what he read at the time was in Sanskrit because he started traveling abroad at the age of 65. Then, around the age of 70, he began studying Sanskrit. So perhaps he was reading the Sanskrit texts. Of course, as for these things, we might be able to engage in listening, contemplation, and various other aspects at the same time. The first step is to search for sources that are genuinely reliable. Then, the goal is to carefully understand the meaning that is presented within those sources. This entire process should be a truly meaningful experience, and this is an important point that I wanted to mention. Regarding the records of Buddhist kingdoms, the underlying reason as to why Faxian read the Shurangama Sutra can possibly be explained in two different ways. So, what exactly are we going to be talking about today? We're discussing the 7 places where the mind is sought in the Shurangama Sutra, specifically the 5th place where the mind is sought. Earlier we talked about the mind is not inside, not outside, and not in between the sense faculties. Nor is it in the inner perception. These are divided into 4 aspects. So today we'll continue discussing this. The Venerable Ananda approached the Buddha and respectfully asked him, saying, I once had the great opportunity to hear the Buddha deliver his profound teachings to the complete 4-fold assembly of disciples. During that discourse, the Buddha explained the fundamental principle that all phenomena arise entirely from the mind. There are myriad things and phenomena, all kinds of them, and various dharmas can be produced. Because these dharmas arise, in fact, all of the different kinds of minds can also arise. Here, when referring to the term dharmas, it means all of the various forms and appearances within the external world. This refers to the vast and diverse collection of all external dharmas, which are the phenomena and objects that we perceive through our senses as existing outside of our own mind. Since it is true that all dharmas without exception arise from the mind, as they are produced by the mind, all of the various external things and natural phenomena, and all different kinds of appearances also truly exist. And because there are all sorts of various forms and phenomena externally, our minds also give rise to all kinds of, for example, when encountering pleasant or attractive objects. They can give rise to our own feelings of attachment or desire. And then, when we are faced with objects that are perceived as ugly or repulsive, it has the potential to give rise to feelings of anger or a sense of aversion. On the other hand, when we encounter objects that naturally and easily inspire a deep sense of respect, we can begin to develop faith in them. When we are faced with pitiable beings, we give rise to a sense of compassion and so on. Our mind produces all kinds of responses. Then the Venerable Ananda said, Now I am going to begin to contemplate upon this very matter, and the essence of our contemplation is actually our own mind nature, our own mind. I've also been reflecting on this continuously, and in the process of thinking, I have the feeling that our conscious mind should not simply be considered non-existent. It still exists. If it does exist, since the external world of phenomena and the internal world of the mind arise in a state of deeply interconnected mutual dependence, he therefore believes that the complete set of all necessary causal conditions are present. Consequently, if all of these conditions are indeed present, then a wide variety of different minds and mental states are able to arise. With all the conditions present, he feels that the mind does not truly exist either externally or internally. So as long as this mind comes into contact with a variety of external conditions, when all of the necessary conditions are present, all sorts of different phenomena will arise. As these phenomena arise in this way, as mentioned earlier, whether internal or external, it is correct that these intermediate states do not truly exist. So I believe that arising through the combination of various causes and conditions is something that should be reasonable. According to Jiaoguang Zhenjian, he says, the reason for this is that Venerable Ananda firmly believes that there must be an underlying and essential nature that is inherent within all phenomena, when in fact things are mutually dependent by nature. He did not understand that the conventional world is like a dream or an illusion. He did not understand such phenomena. Therefore, he strongly insists that there absolutely must be a reality where either the mind exists or phenomena exist. He believes in a kind of substantial existence, just like what I mentioned earlier. This is purely the mindset of some of us today. Whether it's materialism or certain academic circles, it is just a kind of mentality that people have. Within his way of thinking, he simply cannot accept the so-called emptiness of dependent origination, the dreamlike and illusory nature of all things, the ultimate non-existence and the conventional appearance of everything. All of these are very difficult for him to accept. So, as he says next, it is my belief that everything should arise in accordance with its specific causes and conditions. And of course, this is particularly the case if we are to follow the line of reasoning from the Madhyamaka school. The phenomena that arise from the combination of causes and conditions, we can acknowledge that, but the other party doesn't see it that way. He insists on establishing a very credible entity, meaning that the mind itself must have a genuine and real substance. Now, if that is indeed the case, it's very difficult to establish. And so, the Buddha then begins to refute this particular point of view. How does he refute it? The Buddha said to Ananda, so what you are saying now is that because of these phenomena arising, a great variety of different kinds of mind will consequently arise. You say that as causes and conditions come together, and as the mind encounters objects. In that case, aren't you saying that the mind can be produced? That the mind arises as causes and conditions come together? If so, then next the Buddha begins to refute his view. As for refuting his view, it's not very explicit in our scripture here. But actually, there is this point here. Is it that the true nature of your own mind does not exist, or does it in fact exist? If there is such a fundamental question in the middle, then it becomes considerably easier to explain what follows. The Buddha said, didn't you just say, is everything caused? If things arise from causes and conditions, then do you think the mind's own essence does not exist, or does it truly exist? If you were to say that the mind has no actual substance, then it would follow that there is nothing to combine. If you choose the first option and say that the mind's essence has no inherent nature, that the mind is truly without substance. If the mind is without substance, then there is nothing to combine, so it cannot come together. You said that causes and conditions come together, right? But the mind is like a turtle's fur or a rabbit's horn. It doesn't exist at all, not even a little bit. If it doesn't exist at all, then how could it arise from the combination of causes and conditions? This particular point, upon closer examination, simply does not hold up. So the question is, why doesn't it hold up? Let's refute it in greater detail below. Because if there is no real substance to the claim, if this mind is really, as you say, without substance yet able to combine, then what problem would that cause? It would mean the 19 realms arise from the combination of the sense faculties and objects, because the objects should be combined. As for the 19 realms, we all know that these are the 6 faculties, consciousnesses, and objects make 18 realms. Now, the 19th realm, it simply can't exist. It is like the hair of a turtle or even the horns of a rabbit. The 19th realm does not exist in the world. If there is no substance, yet it could still combine, then even the 19 realms could combine as well. And then the 6 objects should exist. Form, sound, smell, taste, touch, and dharmas. The 6 objects do exist. But if they don't even have any substance, and you can still combine them, then the 7th object, if the 7 objects combine, the 7th object simply does not exist in the world. So it would essentially mean that the 7th object could also combine with the others. But this is not the case in principle. In reality, this is absolutely impossible. Because if direct perception is established, then things that have no substance to begin with cannot possibly combine through causes and conditions. So the 19th realm and the 7th dust, if they were to combine together and give rise to something, when you really think about it, this is fundamentally impossible in the world. So for that reason, your argument does not hold at all. Now, this is the first point. If the mind itself has absolutely no substance, these are the resulting faults. Now let's turn our attention to the second aspect. If the mind does have substance, if the mind truly has such a fundamental essence, then, for example, if your hand touches itself, it is both the active agent of the touching and the passive recipient of that touch. Some commentaries say pinching, but if it's pinching, it would appear to be the case that in Tibetan as well, and in Chinese text as well, the character ji fundamentally means to touch. So, for example, when your hand makes contact with your body, do you have any sensation yourself? You definitely have sensation, the mind that knows. At that moment, no matter where your own hand touches, there is always sensation. If there is sensation, then this kind of sensation Does it actually arise from within your very own physical body, or does it truly start from somewhere deep inside the body? Or does it come from outside the body, entering from the external world? He then proceeded to ask two important questions. If you have the sense of touch, then at the moment you have that sensation, that mind. Does it arise from the body or come from outside? If you say it arises from the body, it's still a fault. You're still perceiving it as inside the body. Because the mind is something that clearly knows. If it arises within the body, then as a result it should be able to clearly see the internal organs inside the body. This is the fault. This issue was mentioned in our previous questions. It still exists. You cannot escape such a fault. Therefore, you cannot admit it in this way. If you say it comes from outside, that it enters from the outside, the same fault mentioned earlier still exists, because your mind should be something that clearly knows. If it clearly knows, then it should be able to perceive external objects. By this logic, you should also be able to see your own face. When meeting someone else face to face, you should theoretically first see your own face. But in reality, that's not something that is possible either. If you could genuinely and actually see your own face for yourself, it would have to be in a mirror, or unless your mind could move into the empty space in front of you. And it was only by looking back at yourself that you could actually see it. But these things are not in line with common sense, and so they simply cannot be accepted. This is all about the very same mind that we have just mentioned. Does the mind have an essence or not? We can in fact observe this from two very different perspectives. At this point, Venerable Ananda, he began to respond and said to the Buddha, "That's not quite what I meant. You see, there is still a very large and fundamental difference between the simple act of seeing and the much deeper state of truly knowing. Seeing is what our eyes physically perceive, which is why we so often say the phrase, 'seeing is believing.' It's what the eyes can see. But knowing is what the mind knows, because it's known in the mind. What he actually meant and what he truly wanted to say was regarding those internal organs that were just mentioned, they should be known in the mind. We have 5 viscera and 6 bowels, things like that. And then as for seeing, it's using the faculty of the eyes to see. So you know exactly what your own appearance is like, but you don't necessarily see it with your eyes. The eyes themselves, when their own object of perception is present, they are able to see it. But not everything can necessarily be seen. So what the other person is thinking is that we must analyze the difference between seeing and knowing. Seeing is what the eyes perceive. Knowing is what the mind knows. Non-eye means it's not seen by the eyes. So, as for the so-called non-seeing meaning, as you just said, you should see inside your body, see your own face. These are non-logical, these are unreasonable. What I mean is, if the eyes can see, that's called able to see, and if the mind can know, that's called able to know. Therefore, all of these particular faults that the Buddha has mentioned above should not exist. That's how it is answered. So at this point, the Buddha refutes his viewpoint. So you say the eyes are able to see, right? If the eyes can see and if they can perceive everything, there is still a significant flaw in this logic. He went on to say, if we accept that the eyes can see, then when you are inside of a room, does that mean the door can see as well? He posed a question using an analogy. If it is the eyes that can truly see an object, then when you are sitting inside your own room, in that particular case, your eyes are functioning just like the door. So, can the door itself actually see or not? Because regarding these eyes, earlier, when we made use of the analogy of a crystal, the eyes themselves were likened to that same crystal, and that was essentially the reasoning that was provided to us before. So here, if the eyes could in fact truly see, then, for example, when the door is open, or when you find yourself all alone inside the room, can the door truly see for itself? Because in that space in between, it is actually by relying on the mechanism of seeing through the door that you are able to observe the outside world. If the eyes themselves could genuinely see, then what problem would arise? For example, if a person has already died, but if their eyes do indeed still exist, then it logically follows that they should be able to see all of the things around them. Because if you say the eyes themselves can see, then similarly, the door would also be able to see. This, you see, is the fundamental flaw in this kind of reasoning. If that were the case, then anyone with eyes would be able to see. So, does a corpse actually have eyes? The answer is yes, it absolutely does. In that case, it should also be able to see. If a corpse could truly also see all things, well then, how could it possibly be considered dead? Because it would very clearly be able to see things. If it can in fact clearly see things, if it is able to see things, then you could certainly say this person is still alive, right? Because they can still see everything very clearly. So how could they possibly be dead? They wouldn't be dead yet. If one were to argue that the eyes are truly the ones that see, then by that same logic, a corpse would also be able to perceive things. This is the flaw in that reasoning. Actually, here he is saying that some of these are considered to be reasons that are actually accepted from the opponent's particular point of view. Because when we discuss Madhyamaka or Buddhist logic, some of our fundamental reasoning is built upon certain truths that other people ultimately have no choice but to accept. For example, if you make the statement that the eyes are the organs we use for seeing, then for anyone who is able to see, then they should be able to see many things that they actually shouldn't see. If you say these things cannot be seen, if they cannot be seen, then does that mean there are both seeing and non-seeing aspects in the eyes? Are there two entities? If there are two, one that can see and one that cannot. In that case, one cannot definitively say that the eye is exclusively the seer, because it concurrently has another aspect which is fundamentally not a seer. If it's not a seer, then you can't say, even though the eye has both things it can see and things it cannot see. But if you say, oh, it's called the one that can see, then it can't be called the one that cannot see. That would be unreasonable. For example, take a person. He has experienced periods of poverty and also periods of great wealth. But if you say, oh, this person is wealthy, and only acknowledge the wealthy side of him, while refusing to acknowledge the poor side of life, and this applies even on a global scale, that becomes a very difficult position to justify in any meaningful way, isn't it? So if we consider someone who is a complete materialist and insists on acknowledging the existence of an entity, then these things are just too much. And through logical deduction, we can systematically refute their arguments. In the end, this leaves the other party with no logical escape route, and they will have no choice but to admit the conclusion. This is a well-established method of reasoning. Otherwise, here, if we were to follow the genuine threefold reasoning of Buddhist logic by utilizing both similar and dissimilar examples, besides just including the argument's primary reasons and its main thesis statement, if all of these elements need to be proven independently, one after the other, then it is a good strategy to use some of the admissions your opponent has already made as a solid foundation for making an inference. In the past, His Holiness, from 1999 until he passed away, I was engaged in the work of simultaneous translation for a period of approximately 5 years. When His Holiness tells some familiar stories, sometimes before His Holiness speaks, I'm halfway through. Because I know this story will be told. Sometimes there are some truths that I was not familiar with, especially when it comes to those feel like I have truly never encountered before. When certain terms are mentioned, and I spend a long time thinking about them, His Holiness has already moved on, and as a result, I cannot keep up. So simultaneous translation is also, on the one hand, you don't necessarily have to keep waiting because it's actually a very effective and widely internationally recognized method of translation. But on the other hand, if you don't fully understand all the techniques involved, there are often still some issues. So as for the reasoning I just gave from Buddhist logic, I don't know if it was successful or not. This is the first point. The faculty of seeing is the eye in this respect. Actually, this is a place where we can pause. Then the Buddha continues to tell Ananda, if you say the mind that knows and perceives, didn't you say it's the mind that knows and perceives? The above mainly concerns our discussion about the mind having no inherent nature, like this. And if it does have an inherent nature, some observations were also made. Then continuing on, you talk about the nature of the mind. This is because the fundamental nature of the mind, as we have previously discussed, was strategically employed in conjunction with the specific method of logical reasoning established earlier. It was refuted together. Then it goes on to say, if your clearly knowing and perceiving mind has an inherent nature, if it must have an inherent nature, then I can examine it in greater detail from 4 aspects. Is the nature of your mind? Is it a single entity, or is it in fact multiple entities? Or when we are talking about your current physical body, does it pervade everything? Does it also pervade all forms? Or does your mind not actually pervade the entire body, but instead only pervade a part of it? As some of us currently believe, like the mind is in the brain or the mind is in the heart, then which one is it exactly? In total, there are 4 distinct and important aspects to this examination that we will be covering. For example, if you were to propose the idea that the mind is a single, indivisible entity, that all minds are just one entity, then in that case, When your hand touches something, for example, when one of your hands touches the other, or perhaps when your hand touches your foot, at that precise moment in time, at that very instant, you should make a conscious effort to perceive the sensation that arises simultaneously in all 4 of your limbs, including both your arms and your legs. All 4 limbs should feel as if they are being touched by the hand. For example, say your hand is especially cold, while the rest of your body, for the most part, is feeling relatively warm and comfortable. Then, when you happen to touch your own hand, it's entirely possible that hand immediately feels extremely cold and even icy to the touch. But your foot and your other foot, all of those parts have absolutely no sensation at all whatsoever. From a logical standpoint, if the human mind were truly a single entity, if the mind were truly just one entity, as a consequence, every single part of the body should be able to experience some form of sensation. So, why is that the case? Because the mind is a single entity, and if it really were one entity, it should be able to feel in every corner of the body, because it can have this sensation everywhere in the body. If you first decide, yes, my whole body has sensation, then in that case there would be no specific point of contact. So when you touch something, it wouldn't really exist. In reality, you are only touching my hand and not touching any other part. But if your whole body had that sensation, then of course that's impossible. When I touch my hand, or someone else's hand, only the area being touched has contact and sensation. But it's impossible for other areas to have it. If they did, then the place you're touching, in that case, the specific point of contact wouldn't exist, which is a major flaw. However, if there is a specific point of contact, and what you are touching is something concrete, then that flaw is resolved. If there is something specific like that, then your whole body, as one single entity, could not actually be established. If your entire body already possessed this particular sensation of contact, then what you just said about your mind being one entity would not hold. It could not be established. But generally speaking, this is also something that's considered to be impossible. Because when it comes to the body, wherever you make contact, or if we touch different places, there is always sensation. There should be a refutation below as well. This is the first aspect. If the mind were to be considered a single unified entity, the concept itself wouldn't make logical sense. Therefore, if the mind is in fact a single entity, this particular viewpoint is fundamentally unreasonable. Next is the second point. If it were made of multiple entities, for example, if our mind were to have many, many different natures or bodies, then it would follow that if a person had a mind and it consisted of many entities, that would make them multiple people. In that case, one person would become many people. Why is that? Well, it's because each and every mind, actually, you could say for one person, each sentient being has a different continuum, right? So, let's consider this particular scenario. When you touch the various parts of your body, for example, your foot, your hand, your head, and so on, if each of those parts possessed its own completely independent and different mind, then what we perceive as a single person would in reality become a collection of many different individuals. This person, that person, A, B, C, D, and so on, one person would turn into many people, which is a flaw. In that case, then, which particular entity would you be? If there are truly so many entities out of all of them, then which one of these entities is actually you? For example, if there are a number of choices, A, B, C, D, then among them, which one would you say is truly you? If you ask it like that, it doesn't make sense either. This is the second aspect. If the mind consisted of multiple entities, it wouldn't be reasonable. Now, the third point, if the mind pervaded the entire body, that also wouldn't make sense. So, what problem would that cause? If the mind pervaded the whole body? So, if we were to consider the idea that the mind were present throughout the entire body, then, following the same line of reasoning we discussed earlier, it would mean that the mind truly pervaded everything, every single part of our physical form. So just as we were discussing a little bit earlier, then every single limb would have sensation, and that would certainly be a significant problem. Of course, that is impossible as well. It is also impossible for our mind to fully pervade every single part of the body. That is simply not possible either. But at this particular point, perhaps everyone should really consider. I'll talk about that a bit later. Let me finish this part first, and then maybe it would be better to discuss the sensation of bodily contact. If it does not pervade, if you were to make the argument that my mind is a singular, indivisible entity, but it is in fact localized to one specific area of the body, and therefore does not pervade throughout the entire body, then let's observe the following. Let's consider an interesting thought experiment. Imagine that your head and your foot are physically touched at the exact same time. For instance, I could touch the very top of your head and the sole of your foot simultaneously. So then, at that very moment, you should feel a distinct sensation in your head, but nothing in your foot. So the question is, why is that the case? Because your mind fundamentally only pervades a part. If it only pervades a part, then it must mean that either your mind is actually in your foot or your mind is in your head. So at the same time, if I were to simultaneously touch the bottom of your foot and also touch the top of your head, and even touch your waist and stomach, or if there are different parts all over your body, sometimes when we perform an electrocardiogram, or ECG for short, we attach electrodes to the feet, hands, and also onto the chest. In this situation, the only sensation you should experience is the feeling of the electrodes themselves, and shouldn't feel anything else, because you truly only acknowledge that the mind is a single entity, and that the mind only pervades a part. If that is truly the case, then you should not be able to have any sensations in all of those particular places. Actually, when we look closer here, it is perhaps because, according to the nervous system, in some disciplines, if we talk about some knowledge of the nervous system, they also believe there are many neurons. But among these neurons, the various signals they receive, all of the various kinds of different signals are then distinguished by the mind. However, this particular viewpoint is quite different from our Buddhist logic. Or rather, from the Buddhist perspective, there are differences. So what exactly is different? Actually, there is a very profound reasoning here, and in the commentary on the Pramanavartika, we have also discussed this. A person has eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body consciousnesses. The 6 consciousnesses can arise simultaneously, and non-discriminating consciousnesses can all arise at the same time. But the discriminating mind can only arise as one at a time. If 2 discriminating minds arise, it becomes the continuum of 2 sentient beings. This point is repeatedly emphasized in the Pramanavartika, where it is consistently refuted. So in that case, my body, for example, whether it's the head, the feet, or many other parts, when you make contact, upon contact, the body consciousness is capable of receiving all kinds of different information. But when it comes to actually distinguishing them, only one place can be distinguished at a time. For example, my head and my feet, if both are quite painful, when you feel pain, there is either a general discriminating thought, like my whole body hurts, that kind of feeling, which is a comprehensive sensation, or for example, my head hurts. When your head hurts, if you also feel that your foot hurts and your head hurts at the same time, then, at the same moment, 2 very painful discriminating thoughts cannot arise simultaneously. This is something in the commentary on the adornment of the middle way, where there are different objects and different subjects of perception. There are several, or 3 methods of analysis. But as for these 3 specific methods of analysis, the perspectives of each school are not entirely the same. For example, when we observe all sorts of different and colorful hues, when the eye consciousness apprehends them, how do we actually receive them? Some viewpoints say that however many objects there are just as many subjects of perception. Some people say there is actually only one single subject of perception, but a multitude of different objects. There are different analogies for this. But in actual fact, according to our very own school of thought, when it comes to the specific tactile sensation of the human body, it is generally considered to be a single category. All the forms seen by the eyes are also considered a single category. In this way, we can experience for ourselves that, for example, when I see something with my eyes and find it very beautiful, and I'm becoming attached to it, at that moment, the tactile sensation of my body cannot simultaneously generate a discriminating thought to apprehend it as well. That is impossible. On the one hand, I feel that what I see with my eyes is very beautiful, and if my body also feels a certain way. So, within this framework of non-conceptual direct perception, it becomes possible for both aspects to be experienced directly. I find that this particular explanation from Buddhist teachings is actually remarkably consistent with our own logical framework. Otherwise, it's important to note that on certain occasions, what are often referred to as the methods for analyzing the complexities of the nervous system may have their own ways of explaining things. But when it comes to conceptual thought itself, we only have one conceptual thought at a time. When one conceptual thought arises, it is impossible for other conceptual thoughts to arise at the same time. When you give rise to anger, in the very moment you are experiencing anger, is there also any feeling of jealousy or kindness present? The truth is, none of these other emotions are present. So, at this particular time, aren't we talking about a single continuum? Within a single continuum, this particular kind of consciousness is not the same as what are known as external contradictions. In these aspects, if you study Buddhist logic, it might be a bit easier to understand. I have noticed that a great number of our beloved Dharma friends this year have started signing up for the Buddhist logic and Abhidharma classes. In my personal opinion, if you study more Madhyamaka, it is incredibly important for truly gaining a definitive certainty about emptiness through Madhyamaka. This is still very important. Although the higher philosophical teachings of Abhidharma and the systematic discipline of Buddhist logic are indeed very important for those individuals who are more analytical by nature, sometimes if you haven't studied Madhyamaka, it can be very difficult to resolve the most fundamental issues. But it seems that among both men and women, everyone loves to study the Abhidharma. There are several Abhidharma classes. There aren't as many Madhyamaka classes, but that's okay too. In general, it is our feeling that all of the 5 great treatises are certainly quite important, and that is perfectly fine. But when we analyze this more closely, if we really want to lay a truly solid foundation, ultimately it is very important for us to understand this for ourselves, what is meant by mind and mental factors, especially the mind and mental factors discussed in the Abhidharma and the mind and mental factors discussed in Buddhist logic. It's important to understand that they are basically the same in this regard. The Mahayana Abhidharma and Madhyamaka, in addition, they also do not hold views that are particularly different from one another. This specific aspect is also quite understandable. Therefore, as we have mentioned before, if at the same time, for instance, when you touch your head and your body, it is practically impossible to only feel a single point of contact. Therefore, as for the statement, now, you are not like that, this is something we can establish through direct perception. Now, you are not like that. This is fundamentally impossible. If there are different places, of course there are different perceptions. However, when it comes to this different perception, if it can be produced and experienced at the exact same time, then achieving any kind of separation between them becomes completely impossible. Of course, if you think of this separately, it is simply this discriminating thought concerning the nature of touch that can produce such things. You could certainly put it that way. So, as I mentioned earlier, things truly arise as a direct result of the coming together of various causes and conditions. The mind arises with the combination of causes and conditions, which is meaningless. There absolutely cannot be such a situation, and this is the 5th important point to consider about the mind. I have an imperial edition of the Shurangama Sutra, which is commissioned by Emperor Qianlong at that time. And what is written here is that it should, indeed, be an imperial edition, which is from Emperor Qianlong. It should be like that. And as I remember, it was obtained from the place of Yonghe Temple in Beijing. And next, like this, and then right here at this very spot. This appears to be the preface by the Qianlong Emperor, written in Chinese. When compared with the Tibetan version, there are some noticeable differences. Although the themes are similar, the classical language in the Chinese version makes it more difficult to understand. I also mentioned this briefly a couple of days ago, but when I saw the Tibetan preface, it made me wonder. Perhaps he wrote it in the Tibetan language, or then again, maybe he actually wrote it in Manchu first. And then it was translated into the Tibetan language. I think maybe I should talk about this with everyone in the middle of the lecture. Here it says the following: Preface to the Mahayana Shurangama Sutra, which was written by Qianlong. It says, regarding the Tripitaka and the 12 divisions of the scriptures, this is how Qianlong wrote it. He said the main purpose was to promote it in Tibetan regions. As for Tibetan region, it is considered to be a transit hub for Buddhism, where Buddhism flourished greatly. Even now, it is said to be in Tibetan region. There are all the translated sutras and treatises that exist in the Han area. However, the Shurangama Sutra is one that cannot be found. So what could be the underlying reason for this? The reason is that there was a period of time when Langdharma destroyed Buddhism. All the precious sutras and sacred tantras were facing a period of great destruction. Some of these invaluable texts were burned with fire, and others were buried in the ground for their protection. In this way, this Shurangama Sutra, as a result, it eventually became incomplete and fragmented. Later, many great masters There was a strong desire to restore the text to a more complete and perfect form, but this could not be achieved. The primary obstacle was the lack of a reliable Sanskrit original manuscript to consult. Without such a source, there was no viable way to supplement the text or fill in missing sections. Later, the great Master Bhutan made a significant pronouncement stating that 500 years later, it is said that the Han region would translate the important Shurangama Sutra into the Tibetan language. In fact, there is such a saying. This was mentioned by the national preceptor Zhangjia Hutuktu, who recorded this in the book that he recited. I saw in the Chinese text that it says, in the Sanskrit text he recited, that is the original Sanskrit version, the Sanskrit scriptures. But it is unclear whether the national preceptor Zhangjia actually read the Sanskrit scriptures or not. Moreover, it might not necessarily be in the Sanskrit version. But according to the Tibetan text, it says, it turns out that in the scriptures he recited, there is indeed such a prophecy. If we assume such a prophecy was real, then for a figure as significant as Emperor Qianlong, throughout his daily life he was already confronted with an overwhelming number of worldly matters, including affairs of state that kept him constantly busy. But whenever he had time, he would translate a wide variety of significant Chinese texts into the Manchu language, including the classic Book of Changes and various other important works of poetry, as well as the foundational 4 books and 5 classics. All of these important works were subsequently translated into the Manchu language. So what else did he accomplish? At that time, Emperor Kangxi had already completed a translation of the Heart Sutra into 4 distinct languages. Later, his son, who would become Emperor Yongzheng, arranged for it to be meticulously carved into characters and then printed for wider distribution in order to promote and spread it. This time, he came to the firm conclusion that the Mahayana Shurangama Sutra ought to likewise adhere to this well-established tradition. In this way, it would be more reasonable, right? So, with the full and formal approval of the esteemed national preceptor Zhangjia, following the precedent of the 2 previous emperors who spread the Heart Sutra by translating it into various languages to spread it. He specifically took this Mahayana Shurangama Sutra, mainly because this particular text did not yet exist in Tibet at that time. For example, the Heart Sutra exists in Tibet, but the Shurangama Sutra does not exist in Tibet. So, the very first thing that he wanted to do was to translate it into the Manchu language, then translate it into Mongolian, and then eventually translate it into the Tibetan language. In this way, on the one hand, it would ultimately be more suitable for the prophecy made by Master Bhutan at that time. And on the other hand, he also felt that this undertaking was profoundly and personally meaningful. This conviction drove him to work with incredible and tireless effort, and he then went on to inform a notable royal prince, who was known as Prince Zhuang, so that Prince Zhuang would also know about this matter. Then he ordered him, as well as the national preceptor Zhangjia, and another person by the name of Fu Nai, who was likely a Han individual at that time, then had a number of selected individuals take the Shurangama Sutra in order to carefully examine it, analyze its contents, and begin the process of translating it. During the entire translation process, after each and every volume was fully completed, he made it a strict requirement that Emperor Qianlong himself personally review and formally approve it. And for any parts that were in doubt, he personally consulted with the national preceptor Zhangjia, and only after that did he make the final decision. Then he went on to say that regarding the Qianlong era, and to be more specific about that time period, after doing some calculations, the period in question should have been from 1752 to 1763. Within those 11 years, the translation was completed successfully. It should have been translated into all 3 languages. Then, he explaining that sometime later, Prince Zhuang made a specific request to Emperor Qianlong, asking him to personally compose the preface for a particular work. Later, when the emperor actually began the task of writing this preface, he paused for a moment to reflect and thought to himself, well, the Shurangama Sutra is actually a very extraordinary teaching of Shakyamuni Buddha, a profound esoteric intent and a dharma gate that directly points to the very nature of mind. If it is not properly explained, then the translation would be flawed and unnecessary. However, here, this translation was made directly in accordance with the original words of the Buddha. This was a significant departure from the preceding Song dynasty or even the later Ming dynasty, where it was not uncommon for some monks to express certain minor opinions and disagreements. There was constant arguing, and he did not want that. He did not want this translation to be like that. For example, it's like when someone is in need of food, you simply give them food directly. It is not at all necessary to go to the trouble of seeking out specially cooked meat or to put in the effort to make any other kind of soup. There is simply no requirement to do these additional things for them. By wholeheartedly relying on the profound, non-discriminating wisdom of the enlightened one, Shakyamuni Buddha, if one follows the ultimate truth, one will not be obscured by the various phenomena of the world, which are like rainbows. If one relies on this, one should be able to directly perceive the most supreme, the most definitive, and the ultimate truth of Shakyamuni Buddha and come to understand it. One will not be obscured by the various rainbow-like colorful obstacles of the mundane world. Moreover, by relying on this foundation, the precious Dharma can continue to flourish, and as a result, future students will also be able to gain immense benefits from it. At the same time, his father, the king, and his royal ancestors, they also continued their long-standing tradition of promoting the Heart Sutra, and this spiritual tradition was maintained as well, should be continuously carried on without interruption. So he said that in the 28th year of Qianlong, and so on the 18th day of the 10th month, he finally wrote this preface. I'm not sure how it is in Chinese, but I just gave a general idea. It's only a rough meaning, not a true translation. If I were to actually be the one to truly translate it, just as Qianlong himself said a little bit earlier, I would most definitely write it very seriously as well. Am I right? When you are tutoring, it would be most beneficial if you read it yourselves as well. For example, look at these elders, such as the great kings, and consider how they truly regarded the Shurangama Sutra. We're just talking about it, that's all. In the Tibetan language, the Yongey Temple edition contains this preface. However, in the current Tibetan Tripitaka that we use, specifically the new Taisha Tripitaka, the preface by the Qianlong Emperor is notably absent. The reason for this omission remains unknown. Now let's move on to discuss our sixth point. This one should be relatively simple, but is it really that simple? I'm not entirely sure either. Wait, there's still a whole lot left to do. That can't possibly be right, can it? We really should finish this specific part today. Otherwise, I'm afraid there just won't be enough time. The Venerable Ananda said this, and then continued by saying, this should be the sixth question. World-honored one, I have heard that when you, together with Manjushri Bodhisattva and others, these great Dharma princes, these especially remarkable bodhisattvas, discuss the true nature of reality, the world-honored one said, the mind is not inside, nor is the mind outside. The mind is not inside, nor is it outside. Ever since hearing this, I have been thinking and pondering about the matter. Inside there is nothing to be seen. Indeed, within the mind, nothing can be seen. If there was something to be seen inside, then the internal organs would also be visible. There can be no mutual knowing. It is impossible to know externally. If there were mutual knowing, it would be like two arhats, which is a fault. As for these two lines, actually in the Tibetan version there is not any separate explanation for them. They are explained together with the following parts. Furthermore, it is my observation that Chang Shui, in addition to several others, also includes Jiao Guang. When they explain this here, inside there is nothing to be seen, but outside there is mutual knowing. Not no mutual knowing, but mutual knowing. There are such interpretations. But actually, I think that the difference is not very significant. Both interpretations are acceptable. If we explain it according to his meaning, it would be, inside there is nothing to be seen, and outside there is no mutual knowing. Why is this? It is because there is no knowing within. Because the internal organs, the mind cannot know them. Therefore, as a result, it does not hold up internally. He then continues to explain the Buddha's original intended meaning here. He gives an explanation here. Because there is no knowing within, it definitely does not hold up internally. The mind is not inside. Then, body and mind know each other. Body and mind are mutually aware. It's not that two monks are completely unaware of each other. Because body and mind are mutually aware, the idea of outside does not hold. Outside, it is impossible for the mind to exist. So the mind does not exist outside either. It doesn't exist inside either. So where is it? This is because of mutual knowing, and because the body and mind are mutually aware of one another. Again, there is nothing to be seen within, so maybe it's slightly outside. Because the previous question mainly refuted the view of the mind being inside. And here, although the mind is certainly not outside, still, the view of the mind being inside is impossible. So if it's outside, then it must be in the middle of the outside. It might tend toward the outside. So because of this mutual knowing, it means that, again, nothing is actually seen within. But then somewhere in the middle, on the outside, it should exist. So here, there are different kinds of middle. Earlier, when we talked about the faculty of the eye, we also spoke of the middle of the eye faculty. And here, it's a kind of middle outside. It's not inside, nor is it outside, but still it's in a kind of middle outside. At this point, the following text begins to present a clear refutation of his viewpoint. When I see the opinion of Master Wu Yi, didn't we say earlier that the mind is neither inside nor outside? So in this case, the other side believes that the mind must have some kind of inherent nature or form. He fundamentally doesn't understand that it's an illusory appearance. Both being inside and being outside are just illusory appearances. But Ananda has always believed that the mind must have some kind of inherent nature or form. So he keeps holding on to this point. We are the same. If the mind really had some inherent nature or form, then it would have to be either inside or outside. We insist on finding a place for it. But this is very difficult. The mind itself is also like a dream or an illusion in the worldly sense. In the ultimate sense, not even a speck of it can be established. So this question is still very important. Then, the following discusses in detail how the Buddha refuted his view. The Buddha said, regarding this so-called middle, if you say it is in the middle, that it must have a location and is not without a place. If you are talking about this middle, it can't be vague or ambiguous. It must be clearly defined and also specific. The middle must be clearly explained. It can't be left unclear or muddled. So it cannot be without a location. This mind must have a place to reside, because it is said to be in the middle. If it is in the middle, it can't possibly have no location at all. If there isn't even a single place, that's impossible. So, regarding the middle you mentioned, we can also understand it this way. When you say middle, it must be between two things. Either it's the middle of the body, or it's the middle of something outside. There should be a middle of something. Otherwise, there's no way to have a middle. If we reason it out this way, then what exactly is this concept of the middle? And where then is this middle located? If the other person says, when it comes to the middle, there are two situations. One is that it exists as a location, like the middle of a physical object, such as between two pillars, or the middle between two places, like the border between Nepal and India, or the boundary between Yunnan and Sichuan. So it becomes clear that the middle can refer to something completely external. Or there is the middle of the body, the middle between the root of the body and the body itself, something like that. So there are two possibilities. First of all, let's talk about the middle of the body. If it is indeed located within the body, if you say it's in the middle of the body, then it's not at the edge, but in the center. If it's the middle of the body, then the outside of the body's skin, the surface of the skin, in that case, that's not the middle. That is not referring to the middle. Instead, it is describing a location on the outside of the physical body. For instance, if this sensation is at the very edge of the body, as if the mind is located outside the body, being dragged, suspended, or something similar to that, then it's outside, not inside. It's at the edge, not the center. If it's right in the middle, if it's inside the body, for example, inside the belly, inside the skin, or perhaps inside the bones, or let's say inside your internal organs, then, as we have discussed previously, if the mind is truly inside, all the internal organs should be visible. It's the same as being inside. This is a flaw. First, being in the middle of the body doesn't hold up. Didn't you just say the middle? Is the middle the center of the body, or is it the center of some other material thing? If it's not in the center of the body, but outside, in fact, when talking about the Shurangama Sutra, maybe it would be better if you have studied Yinming, the Buddhist logic. Otherwise, if you don't understand Yinming, you might, if never learned these reasonings, it may seem to be a little bit difficult, right? Those of us who have studied Buddhist logic have a lot of confidence in it. The other day, when I was watching the 7 locations of investigating the mind, many young people were especially passionate about it. During the lecture, some even started jumping up. I saw during the exam review that day, some people already had a foundation in this topic, and their explanations were quite good. Next, it's about if something is in the middle of a location, does that location serve as a reference point, or does it not serve as a reference? A reference is essentially something to compare against, or a benchmark, or simply a kind of marker. So do you actually think there is a middle or not? Is there some kind of established point of reference, or is there not? If there is no reference, then it's just like the son of a barren woman. It simply doesn't exist, just like empty space. So when you talk about the middle, what exactly is it the middle of? Because if these two things don't really exist in relation to each other, if they don't exist, then what you're talking about is just like empty space. It's as if nothing exists at all. But if you say there are some reference points, something to serve as a marker, some kind of labeled object, then in that case it becomes indeterminate. And if that's the case, it doesn't necessarily have to be in the middle. Why is that? Because, in fact, when it comes to reference points, they depend on people's conceptual distinctions and locations. And people's orientations are all established differently. But if you want to talk about something being in the so-called middle, there must be some kind of fixedness. In that case, if you use a person as the reference point, then if the reference point is in the middle, when observing from the east, an object will appear to be on the west side relative to your position. In the same way, if you look from the south, that same object now becomes the north side. This raises the question of whether there can truly be something we call the middle, since its definition changes based on where you stand. For example, if we establish a reference point in what we define as the West, and we think it's between East and West, but if a Westerner looks at it, it's actually closer to the east side. And if you look from the south, it's on the north side. So even with many of our current geographical locations, here we call them Westerners, and over in America they're called Easterners. Sometimes we talk about Easterners and Westerners, but for them, it's not really a rigidly defined concept, especially if we take a moment to look at the Earth as it is in the present day when it comes to the geographic North and South poles. It's impossible to use East and West as markers. At the South Pole, everything is north, and the reference points you observe from there all belong to that direction. The situation is the same at the North Pole. So if we have a fixed so-called middle now, if there really is such a thing as a middle to begin with, then it just doesn't work. This method doesn't apply here, especially when it comes to our minds. If we try to place them at the center of the east, south, west, and north directions, it's simply not possible. All these things outside of ourselves, the principle of dependent origination, establishing things in dependence on conditions, is reasonable. Because if we temporarily rely on relative establishment, then it's workable for the time being. But when it comes to the ultimate reality, it doesn't truly exist. If that's the case, the appearance and essence will become confused. If you say it's between east and west, then, if it shifts even just a little bit when that specific label moves, it is no longer positioned between east and west. Rather, it should now be found between south and north. So when you reason like this, in the end, the mind also becomes chaotic. There is absolutely no possible way to fully establish a truly central mind. This is the first aspect of the problem. Then the second aspect, at that time, Ananda said, the so-called center is not the east, south, west, or north. It's not that kind of center. It should be what you, Buddha, have spoken of. If I and form serve as conditions, then consciousness arises. The I serves as the dominant condition and form as the object condition. Finally, relying on the immediately preceding condition, what is produced? I consciousness is produced. So this is how it is explained in our Buddhist logic and Madhyamaka, as well as in the Abhidharma Kosha. If consciousness arises depending on the I and form, then this consciousness can exist. So what is this consciousness like? He explains below. The I has discrimination. Here, the I generally refers to our physical I, which does not have discrimination. I consciousness also does not have discrimination. Only when mental consciousness joins with I consciousness at the end does discrimination arise. But here perhaps it means that it has a clear aspect. Perhaps it is the I simply because it can comprehend objects. It can see things. Maybe that's the level he's talking about. So the I has discrimination. Then as for dust or form, it does not have discrimination. And the mental consciousness in between can be inserted in the middle, and it can arise. Actually, it is well worth considering that perhaps this very same idea is also refuted in the Pramanavartika, and it is also refuted in the Wisdom chapter. On the other hand, the opposing point of view is that Jiaoguang himself said, although Ananda was indeed extremely learned, he could not understand the Buddha's teaching on the concept of dependent origination. His explanation is also correct. He said that these wise and well-learned people all have a common flaw. They're all either focused outwardly or inwardly. Though he is well-read and knowledgeable, he truly is well-read and knowledgeable. He would often say, how did you teach Fourfold Assembly? How did you teach Manjushri Bodhisattva? Furthermore, on a subsequent occasion, he would also make an inquiry asking, what was the specific method you used to teach disciples such as Maudgalyayana, Purna, and the others? In all these cases, it's just like some scholars nowadays. What does this book say about it? What does that book say about it? He memorizes all these words and numbers completely. He can recite them all by heart, but when it comes to the truly profound meanings within them, he doesn't understand any of them. So for those of us who are deeply involved in the world of academia, we really ought to reflect on this matter. We must not follow Ananda's example. Ananda, as it is said, although he was well versed, he couldn't grasp what he heard. This is actually correct. You see, he really believed that between form and the sense faculty is the eye consciousness. The mind consciousness is also in the middle. He doesn't know what eye consciousness is. That is exactly why it is explained in this manner here. Then the Buddha begins to refute his particular view. As for the process of refuting his view, everyone needs to pay a bit more attention at this part. It's a little harder to understand. Well, how should I put it? The main point is, as was actually mentioned a bit earlier, there must be a consciousness, eye consciousness, between the sense faculty and the object. So the mind exists. Now the Buddha begins to refute him. If your mind is between the sense faculty and the object, this mind of yours. So if the mind is positioned somewhere between the faculty of the eye and the external form it perceives, then does this mind actually form a connection with both of these, or does it connect with neither of them? What he is essentially asking here is, isn't your mind supposed to be located somewhere in the middle? If it's in the middle, so does it have a relationship that connects it with both the faculty and the object? Or on the other hand, does it have no relationship at all with either of them? In this context, the word connect means, in Tibetan, does it mean together or at the same time? Or does it mean they are all connected? Is there a connection? It's possible that this is the intended meaning, because any other interpretation would be quite difficult to understand. So to begin, let's talk about the specifics of this relationship. If we assume that it relates to both the faculty and the object, and that it serves to connect the two of them, then what kind of problems would actually arise? There would be confusion among objects, and the object would not be directly known by the faculty. If the two are opposed and stand separately, how can it possibly be considered the middle? If you say this middle is not actually between the faculty and the object, here object refers to the external thing, and faculty refers to the sense organ, then both the faculty and the object would be mixed up. Why is that? Because the mind consciousness is related to the external object and also related to the internal faculty. If that's the case, then a single mind consciousness would contain aspects of the object, the external substance, and also aspects of the physical faculty. In this way, the mind consciousness, the faculty, and the object, ultimately all three of them would end up being completely opposed to each other. If they are so opposed, how could it be possible for them to all be mutually related? It's simply impossible. So at this point, everyone should really think this through carefully. What should we be thinking about? Most of us tend to believe that the object is the dust that exists externally, and that the eye faculty exists as well. And then there is also a mind consciousness. There is a mind consciousness between the faculty and the object. Those who have studied the Abhidharmakosha, or Buddhist logic, all know that this is fundamentally impossible. Although the external object serves as the object of perception, and we rely on it, the eye faculty plays a facilitating role as a dominant condition. And then relying on these two conditions, eye consciousness arises. This is our basic principle, but Ananda did not understand and thought that so-called eye consciousness should exist between the faculty and the object. How could there be such a thing? This is unreasonable. If that were the case, then our eye consciousness would have a part belonging to the faculty and a part belonging to the object. The part belonging to the faculty would mix with the faculty, and the part belonging to the object would mix with the object. In that case, eye consciousness would also have a material component of form, and also a part of the faculty's ability to see. In the end, the faculty itself would have a part with no real substance at all. That would be completely... In fact, some substantialist schools are just like this. They insist that there must be something that can be connected through consciousness. If that's the case, then your faculties and consciousness would all be mixed together. If that is actually the case, then the object and the faculty would inevitably be mixed together. And as a result of that, the object and consciousness would also then become mixed together as well. And even consciousness and the faculty would be mixed together again. If these three phenomena end up all mixed together, then you wouldn't know which is consciousness, the object, and the faculty. If you lack this distinction, then it's impossible to connect them all together if at the same time all three have to be connected together. What exactly is so-called visual consciousness? Is it a kind of mental consciousness or a non-sentient dharma, or is it something else entirely? There's simply no way to tell. On one hand, these phenomena are extremely distinct from each other. Whether it's the perceiver or the perceived, or the faculty or the object, if all of these are mixed together as one, then that's unreasonable. Earlier, the term wu fei should be understood to refer to the faculty, and in a similar fashion, tiji is what refers to the object. So, if that is indeed the case, then it follows that all of these are in fact mutually distinct. How could mutually distinct dharmas possibly exist together as one? It's impossible. That's the first aspect. The second aspect is that they're not together as one. If they're not combined together, so then the non-knowing does not know. And at this particular point, you could certainly say that it is neither knowing nor not knowing. Here, neither knowing nor not knowing, because they are not together as one. If they are not together, the faculty is not the object, and the object is not the faculty. Then the mind is also not together with them. If the mind is not together with the object, and the mind is not together with the faculty, or if the mind, object, and faculty are not together, then how could it have any inherent nature? It simply has no inherent nature at all. So at that point, how could you call it the middle? Observing this, everyone should understand now this so-called the mind between the object and the faculty. This is very simple. If you look for a way for the object and faculty to connect, it's impossible. If the three were able to connect, then everything would be mixed together. If the object and the faculty have no relation, then in the middle, the mind would be without substance. It's unrelated to the faculty or the object. No one would accept that. So, where is this so-called middle? You should get it by now. If not, I can't help. I've tried so hard to explain it, right?
Bandara